I arrived at Malbork on a night when the rain didn't fall in sheets, but in a steady, patient whisper. That kind of drizzle you don't notice at first, until your coat grows heavy and the cold starts working its way into your bones. The castle rose out of the darkness like a continent made of red brick, towers, walls, and sharp Gothic angles, so large it felt less like a building and more like a decision that could never be undone. The last tour group was long gone. The guide's voice had faded into memory. Even the distant footsteps of other visitors had thinned out, leaving only wind sliding through the courtyards and the soft, hollow sound of water dripping from stone. I wasn't there as an adventurer. I wasn't chasing treasure or ghosts. I came the way a modern person comes to old places, with questions, a notebook, and a stubborn need to understand how a story turns into a system. Because that's what Malbork is, not just a castle, a system made visible. A fortress that once held together an order of men who prayed like monks, organized like merchants, and defended like soldiers. The Teutonic Order, admired, feared, argued over, still, even now, centuries later. We like history when it behaves like a simple tale, a hero, a villain, a clean moral. But standing under those walls, I felt something more unsettling. History rarely gives you clean lines. It gives you human beings, frightened, faithful, ambitious, exhausted, doing what they think they must do, one practical choice at a time, until the consequences become enormous. I drifted deeper into the castle, through corridors that smelled faintly of damp brick and old wood. Torchlight wasn't real torchlight anymore, of course, just museum lighting, yet the shadows still gathered in the corners the same way they always have. And in a quiet room behind glass, I saw it. A black cross on white. Simple, stark, almost modern in how little it needed to say. And that's when it happened. At first, it was barely a sound, like the smallest tap of metal against glass or a fingernail against wood. I turned my head. Nothing. No footsteps, no voices, no one playing a trick. Then came another sound, not in the room, but in my mind, like a sentence spoken behind my thoughts, clear enough that I could almost hear the breath around it. If you want to understand the Black Cross, don't start with a castle. Start with a sail. A sail? I stood still, suddenly aware of how strange it was that one short line could change the way a whole fortress looked. I'd come to Malbork expecting to begin with stone, walls, battles, treaties, politics, but that sentence pulled the floor out from under my assumption. A sail wasn't a weapon. A sail wasn't a throne. A sail was fabric, meant to catch wind and carry ships, not build empires. And yet I knew what it meant. Acre, the Levant, the Third Crusade. The year wasn't printed in the air, but my brain supplied it anyway, like a footnote it couldn't stop itself from adding. The beginning for the Teutonic Order wasn't here in northern Europe. It was on a distant coastline under a different sky, where heat and salt and smoke mixed into the same breath. I closed my eyes for a moment, the way you do when you're trying to steady your senses. The rain outside kept ticking. The castle didn't move, but something in me shifted, as if the place had leaned in closer. I don't believe in time travel, not in any literal sense, but I do believe places keep memories. Not memories like a person does, with clear images and words. More like pressure, like a weight that stays in the walls, in the air, in the way your footsteps sound when you walk alone at night. Some locations are so full of human intention, fear, prayer, labor, loss, that you can feel them even if you don't want to. And Malbork felt full, not with ghosts exactly, with echoes. I imagined the castle as it would have been in its own time, torches truly burning, not electric bulbs, wet cloaks hanging at the edges of corridors, the scrape of boots on stone, the murmur of Latin prayers, a bell marking the hours like a heartbeat, men moving in strict lines not because they wanted to, but because discipline was the only way to survive what they had built. So that thought led me back to the sail, because a sail doesn't belong to a castle. A sail belongs to a shore. It belongs to ships and storms and improvisation. It belongs to the kind of desperate practicality that happens when people run out of options. And suddenly, I could smell it. Not brick, not wax, not old paper. Salt, wet rope, smoke. It came so sharply that I opened my eyes again, half expecting to see sea mist drifting through the museum glass. Nothing changed. The display stayed still, the black cross fixed behind the pane. But my mind was already somewhere else, building the first scene without asking my permission. A coastline in darkness, a camp stretching along the shore like a second city made of canvas, torches scattered like nervous stars, the silhouette of a fortified wall in the distance, and between the tents, the sound that armies try to pretend doesn't exist, the low, constant presence of suffering. That's the part most heroic stories skip. They show banners and speeches and shining armor. They don't show the slow work of disease and exhaustion. They don't show men who survive the battlefield only to be broken by infection, thirst, or heat. But if you want the true beginning of the Teutonic Order, you have to start there, in the part of war that isn't glorious. Because the first Teutonic fortress wasn't a fortress, it was shelter. A place made from sailcloth and scraps of timber, something temporary, something humble. A place built because people were dying and no one was doing enough to keep them alive, especially the German-speaking wounded who couldn't even ask for help in the language most of the camp understood. That's the origin that never sits comfortably beside the image of a militarized order, a medical need, a language problem, a human problem, and a decision. No one assigns you that kind of work in a siege camp. No one hands you a title and says, "You are now responsible for the broken bodies in this corner." Not at first. At first, it's simply someone looking around and realizing that if they don't act, no one else will. So I stood in Malbork, staring at a black cross, and I kept thinking about that sail, about the hands pulling it tight, tying it down, turning a piece of ship into a roof. That's why this story has always bothered me in a way that doesn't let go, because it begins with care. It begins with practical mercy and small acts of organization. And when something begins that way, we want to believe it stays that way. But history doesn't promise that. History takes good ideas and puts them under pressure. It feeds them with money. It wraps them in politics. It tests them with fear. And slowly, almost invisibly, it changes their shape. Until one day you look up and realize the sail has become a uniform. The uniform has become a banner. And the banner flies over a castle big enough to govern a country. That's the transformation I came to understand. Not to excuse it, not to condemn it in a single sentence, just to see it clearly. A group of men trying to do something decent in a brutal place and creating an institution powerful enough to outlive the place that birthed it. I leaned closer to the glass. The black cross was still, silent, clean-edged, a symbol designed to be remembered. And I realized something else, something that felt uncomfortably modern. We're not so different. We still build systems out of emergencies. We still create organizations to solve real problems. We still tell ourselves we can control what those organizations become. But once you build a structure that works, once it gathers resources, authority, loyalty, it starts to want a future. And futures demand choices. Choices demand compromises. And compromises reshape the mission until it no longer looks like the thing you started with. The night rain kept falling outside. In the distance, somewhere in the castle complex, a door clicked shut. The sound echoed and then died. And in the quiet that followed, that earlier sentence returned, steady, almost gentle. Don't start with the castle, start with the sail. So that's where I'll begin. Not with red brick, not with conquest, not with legends carved into stone, with fabric soaked in sea wind, with a makeshift shelter raised in the dark outside Acre, with the first moment someone decided that service could be organized, and that organization could become destiny.
The night wind outside Acre didn't feel like the wind back home. It wasn't clean or cool. It carried salt off the sea, smoke from 1,000 campfires, and something harder to name: the weight of too many people pushed into too little space, waiting for a city to break. In the summer of 1190, the Crusader camp along the shoreline had become a world of its own. Rows of tents, makeshift lanes carved through mud and sand, torches flickering like restless eyes. Beyond it all, Acre's walls stood as a dark, stubborn silhouette, refusing to surrender. And under those walls, men whispered prayers, argued, coughed, and bled, mostly not from wounds, but from sickness that moved faster than any army. I want you to picture the camp at its quietest hour, when the shouting fades and the sea becomes the loudest thing. Even then, the place never truly sleeps. There is always a groan from a corner tent, always someone calling for water, always the soft shuffle of feet carrying the wounded away from the front lines. That's where I first noticed him. Not a knight, not a lord, just a man with the posture of someone used to hauling rope and counting cargo. I'll call him Nicholas, not because history gives us a perfect name and the perfect face, but because every story like this needs one steady set of eyes, someone who isn't born into greatness, yet ends up standing close enough to it to feel the heat. Nicholas moved through the camp like a person who knows what chaos looks like and refuses to accept it as normal. His cloak was dusty, his boots heavy with mud, his hands marked by work, merchant hands, not warrior hands. He had come east with the German contingents, tied to trade routes and community obligations as much as to faith. And then he heard it, a voice that didn't fit the language around it. In a dim corner of an improvised infirmary, a young German soldier lay curled on straw. His eyes were open, but unfocused, like someone trapped between fever and fear. Beside him stood a medic, French-speaking, quick, practiced, gesturing for answers, asking questions, trying to assess what hurt and how badly. But the wounded man didn't understand, or couldn't. He tried to speak anyway. The words came out broken, thin, desperate. Wasser, Mutter. Water, mother. The medic hesitated. Not cruel, just stuck. In a siege camp, hesitation can be fatal. You can't treat what you can't understand, and comfort matters more than people like to admit. Pain is not only physical, it's also the terror of being alone among strangers, unable to explain yourself as the world closes in. Nicholas stepped in without asking permission. He knelt, he offered a water skin. He spoke in German, simple, steady words, the kind that don't require strength to hold on to. Easy, you're not alone. I understand. The wounded man drank, slowly. Not like a cinematic rescue, not like a miracle, just a few swallows, carefully, with the weak rhythm of someone clinging to life. But in that small exchange, something changed. You could feel it. The air softened. The soldiers' breathing steadied. And Nicholas saw what the camp had been too busy to notice, a gap that could swallow men whole. There were hospitals in the Crusader states. There were famous orders who specialized in care, but language was a wall of its own. German-speaking wounded lay among people who could not reach them with words, and in that era, words were medicine too. That night, Nicholas returned to his own circle, other merchants and men from the German towns of the north, Bremen and Lübeck among them. They met near stacked crates and ship timber, close enough to the sea that everything smelled faintly of salt and tar. Someone said what everyone was thinking. We can't leave them like that. Another man answered with the caution of a person who understands risk. We are merchants, not appointed healers, not knights of a great order. Nicholas listened, then spoke a line that would later feel like the first stone laid in a foundation. If no one assigned it to us, then we take it on. There was a silence after that. Not disagreement, but recognition, because every man in that circle understood organization. They understood supply. They understood how to make something function when conditions were terrible, and in a siege, function could mean survival. So they began building a hospital, not a grand building, not even a proper house, a shelter, humble, urgent, improvised. They went to the shoreline where the ships lay at anchor, and they begged, bargained, and scavenged what they could. Sailcloth, timber, rope, anything that could be turned into structure. The sailcloth came down in heavy, wet bundles, smelling of sea and wind and travel. The timber was rough and splintered, pulled from crates and spare boards. Men hammered stakes into hard sand and packed earth. They raised beams with rope and muscle. They stretched the canvas until it pulled tight and began to look less like fabric and more like a roof. It was labor, not romance, and yet, seen from the right angle, torches flaring, cloth snapping in the wind, silhouettes moving with purpose, you could mistake it for something mythic. Inside the tent, they placed cots in lines, bowls for water, linen strips for bandages, jars of vinegar and honey. Simple medieval remedies, but better than nothing. They kept a corner for herbs, traded from anyone who had them. The work was relentless. Water had to be carried, linen had to be boiled, wounds had to be washed. The camp did not run out of wounded. When the first German-speaking patients were carried in, the hospital felt like a lighthouse. Lanterns glowed under canvas. Familiar words met frightened eyes. It wasn't a cure, it was a refuge. And then a priest arrived. Not with grandeur, not with a procession, just a man in simple vestments, holding a candle, stepping carefully between cots. He spoke Latin as the church required, but when he leaned close to the dying, he used German. Quiet reassurance, familiar phrases, a reminder that even in a foreign land, someone could still speak to your soul in the language you were born into. For a medieval soldier, that mattered, not because it erased pain, but because it placed pain inside a story, and people endure suffering more easily when they believe it has meaning. Later, some would say the night the hospital was finished, the weather shifted, that the wind calmed for a breath, that a faint streak of light crossed the sky like a falling star, and the soldier whispered, "The Virgin has seen us."
Maybe it happened, maybe it didn't. Siege camps breed rumors the way stagnant water breeds sickness. But the legend tells us something true anyway. Human beings need signs when they live on the edge of collapse. They need to believe that effort is noticed by God, by fate, by something higher than mud and blood and fever. Nicholas didn't build the hospital because he saw an omen. He built it because he saw a problem. But once the hospital stood, he felt the weight of what they had done. Because here's the thing no one tells you about good deeds in hard times. Once you create something that works, people begin to rely on it. Once people rely on it, it needs rules, it needs supplies, it needs authority. And authority has a way of growing roots. Nicholas stepped outside the tent one night, torchlight reflecting in puddles, and looked toward Acre's walls. They were still there. The siege was still grinding on. The suffering had not ended. But in that moment, he understood. A shelter made of sailcloth could outlast the storm that demanded it, if enough hands kept tying the knots. And that possibility was both beautiful and frightening. Because if a hospital could be organized, supported, expanded, then it could also become an institution. And institutions don't stay small for long. At dawn, the Mediterranean brightened into a pale shimmer. Camp smoke rose in columns, and ships rocked gently offshore. The hospital tent stood near the shoreline, canvas walls breathing in the wind, lantern light fading as daylight took over. Inside, men slept, coughed, prayed, and waited. Nicholas stood at the entrance, watching attendants move from cot to cot, checking bandages, offering water, speaking softly. His face was tired, smeared with soot and salt, but his posture had changed, not proud, not triumphant, just resolved. Because he had done something simple in a place where simplicity was rare. He had seen suffering, and instead of looking away, he had built an answer with his own hands. And whether he understood it or not, that was the first step on a road that would lead far beyond Acre, far beyond sailcloth, toward stone walls, iron rules, and the black cross that would one day cast a long shadow across Europe. But for now, it was only a tent by the sea, and in that tent, a wounded man could finally hear a familiar voice say, "I understand." The siege camp had, yet the air was still restless, full of pilgrims, soldiers, merchants, and the constant awareness that the coastline was only a thin strip of safety. The German hospital, once a shelter of sailcloth and salvaged timber, now stood within stone walls. That alone felt like a transformation. A building is something you can fold up and abandon. A building is something that asks you to stay. It needs keys, storerooms, rules, schedules. It needs someone to decide what happens when supplies run low, or when too many wounded arrive at once, or when outsiders demand entry. Nicholas, still more merchant than monk in his instincts, could feel the hospital changing the people inside it. The work was no longer a desperate improvisation. It was becoming a routine. Beds were arranged with purpose, water was rationed, linen was boiled and stacked. A ledger appeared, then another. Names, donations, expenditures. The language of survival began to look a lot like the language of administration. And Acre was the perfect place for an institution to learn that language. Because Acre wasn't just a fortress, it was a port, a hub where everything passed through. Pilgrims seeking holy sites, merchants shipping supplies, envoys bringing letters from Europe, and rival orders moving through the city with their own rules and symbols. Nicholas watched them closely. He saw the Hospitallers, black-robed, disciplined. Their care work not only compassion, it was organization. Clean wards, strict routines, a structure that could outlast any single campaign. And he saw the Templars, white mantles, red crosses, mounted and ready, moving with the confidence of men who believed their purpose was both sacred and strategic. They didn't just protect roads, they protected influence. Their strength was a message. In that environment, the German hospital was still young, still fragile. It had a purpose, but not yet a recognized identity. It could be ignored, absorbed, or pushed aside by older powers. It was serving the wounded, yes, but it was also competing for legitimacy in a city where legitimacy determined survival. That's when a new idea began to spread among the brothers and the merchants who supported them. If they stayed only a hospital, they would always depend on others for protection. Roads were dangerous, pilgrims were vulnerable outside the city, and the Holy Land, even in its quieter moments, never stayed quiet for long. There was a question that refused to go away. What happens when the people you care for need more than medicine? He heard it in the voices around him. He heard it in arguments that began calmly and ended in silence. Some said, "We were created to serve the sick. If we turn toward violence, we will lose ourselves." Others answered, "If we cannot defend our patients and pilgrims, our service becomes a promise we can't keep."
It was a moral dilemma, but also a practical one. In a world like this, goodness without protection was fragile. Yet protection could become something else, something darker, if it wasn't anchored. Nicholas, with the modern mind of a merchant, saw another problem beneath the debate. Without structure, they wouldn't last at all. A hospital can be built quickly. An institution takes recognition. Recognition meant privileges, the right to receive lands and donations, the right to manage property, the right to elect leaders, the right to exist independently rather than a temporary charity. In medieval Europe, those rights didn't come from good intentions. They came from documents sealed in wax, documents that had to be recognized by the church and the powers of Christendom. So Nicholas did what he knew how to do. He began to think in letters and seals. He worked with men who could write in the formal Latin required for serious petitions. He watched priests shape words into the language Rome would accept. And slowly, the German hospital started to speak with a voice that wasn't just German, it was institutional. They drafted petitions to the papacy. They described their mission to care for the sick, to shelter pilgrims, to serve in the Holy Land with discipline and piety. They didn't present themselves as a passing group of volunteers. They presented themselves as a community ready to live under a rule. To a modern audience, it can sound cold, this idea that mercy needs paperwork. But in that era, paperwork was protection. It turned a temporary project into something permanent. It gave the hospital a future. And then, in the year 1198, the future arrived in the form of a papal decision. Pope Innocent III, one of the most powerful pontiffs in the Middle Ages, recognized the German hospital as a religious institution, granting it privileges that allowed it to function like the other great orders of the Holy Land. This was the moment when the hospital stopped being only a place and became a name. The formal title was long, as medieval titles tended to be. In practice, it meant something simpler. The German brothers were now a recognized order within Christendom. To Nicholas, the recognition didn't feel like triumph, it felt like weight. Because once Rome legitimizes you, you no longer belong only to the moment that birthed you. You belong to a mission that expects to continue. And continuing means rules. Continuing means hierarchy. Continuing means decisions that will shape lives for generations. The order chose the rule of St. Augustine, a rule built for communal life, shared property, obedience, charity, a rhythm of prayer and work. It suited them because they weren't trying to become a band of independent warriors. They were trying to become something that could endure. They organized themselves into 3 roles that reflected their reality. There were the Knight brothers, responsible for protection and defense, men who would be trained to fight when necessary, under discipline rather than personal ambition. There were the priest brothers, responsible for sacraments, prayer, and spiritual guidance, ensuring that the order remained, at least in theory, anchored to its religious purpose. And there were the serving brothers, the backbone of daily life, men who handled supplies, records, transport, food, the endless work that keeps a hospital and a household functioning. Nicholas understood those divisions instinctively. He'd spent his life among people who specialized: sailors, accountants, carpenters, traders. You didn't survive long voyages by pretending everyone could do everything. You survived by knowing who did what and holding them to it. That was one of the quiet truths behind the order's rise. Its founders came from merchant cities that understood logistics. When you combine faith with organization, you create an engine. But engines don't choose where they go. People choose, and people are not always consistent. Even after papal recognition, the question of militarization didn't disappear. It only became sharper because now the order had permission to expand, permission to accept recruits, permission to take vows. That permission also carried expectations. Other orders defended roads and fought in battles. If the German brothers wanted equal status, they would be asked to carry equal burdens. Nicholas watched the shift happen in small increments. A serving brother might start learning to handle a spear because bandits had been seen outside the gate. A brother assigned to escort pilgrims might begin wearing heavier armor. A training yard might appear beside the hospital courtyard, not because anyone loved war, but because the Holy Land did not reward innocence. He also watched the effect of symbols. The first time a brother wore a white mantle marked with a dark cross, it wasn't just cloth, it was identity. It told the city, the pilgrims, the rival orders, we exist, we are not temporary, we have a place here. And it told the brothers something even more powerful. You now represent something larger than yourself. In the evenings, after the day's work, Nicholas would sometimes stand at the edge of the courtyard and listen. From the chapel, Latin prayers rose like a steady current, meant to cleanse the day and prepare the soul for the next. From the yard, you might hear the controlled thud of training, the disciplined movement of men learning to protect what they served. That combination, prayer and preparation, was the order's defining tension. It was also its strength. From a modern perspective, it's easy to ask the question that haunts every institution born from crisis. Could it have stayed purely charitable? Maybe for a time, but in the Holy Land, charity without protection was exposed, and protection without charity became something else entirely. So the order tried to balance both. Whether it succeeded is the debate that would follow it across centuries. Nicholas, at the very beginning, didn't see centuries. He saw a ward of men who needed German words to ease their fear. He saw the practical need to coordinate supplies. He saw that without recognition, the hospital might be swallowed by politics or violence. He wanted stability. He wanted a framework strong enough to hold compassion in place. And that is perhaps the most modern part of this medieval story, the belief that if you build the right structure, you can keep your mission pure. But structures grow, structures adapt, and once an institution can survive, it begins to want more than survival. It begins to want purpose on a larger scale. That night in Acre, with the city's lights flickering beyond the walls and the sea wind moving through narrow streets, Nicholas understood something he couldn't fully put into words yet. The sailcloth hospital was gone. In its place stood an order with a rule, a symbol, and a future. And the future was already pulling them away from the coast, towards new frontiers where their organizational strength would become something far bigger than a hospital. Acre was no longer just a place where they treated wounds. It was the forge where they learned how to become permanent.
Acre didn't vanish from the Teutonic Order's mind overnight, but the center of gravity was already shifting. The Holy Land was expensive to hold, dangerous to defend, and brutally unpredictable. And Hermann von Salza, the man who would shape the Order's future more than any other, understood something that sounds obvious to us today, but was revolutionary in practice back then. If you want an institution to survive, you need stability. And in the medieval world, stability meant one thing above all: land. Not just any land, land you could govern, land you could farm, land that could feed horses and men, fund fortifications, hospitals, and finance the endless costs of war and diplomacy. Land meant grain and timber, tolls and courts, roads and rights. It meant you didn't have to beg for your future every time the political wind changed. Hermann von Salza wasn't a dreamer. He wasn't the type to chase glory for its own sake. He was a strategist, and more than that, he was a man who could speak multiple languages of power at once. To the church, he spoke as a faithful servant. To emperors and kings, he spoke as a political actor. And to merchants, he spoke as someone who understood supply lines, contracts, and long-term planning. Under his leadership, the order began to ask a question that would reshape everything. Where can we exist without being swallowed? The first answer came from far away, from the mountains and borderlands of Eastern Europe, in a place that looked nothing like Acre. In the year 1211, King Andrew II of Hungary invited the Teutonic Knights to settle in a frontier region called Burzenland, on the edge of Transylvania. It was remote, vulnerable, and constantly threatened by raids from steppe nomads, especially the Cumans. Andrew wanted a disciplined force that could hold the line. For the Teutonic Order, it looked like opportunity. Not just an opportunity to fight, but an opportunity to build. This mattered because it was the first time the Order was offered something more than a house or a hospital. They were being offered a zone of responsibility, a piece of territory where they could construct fortifications, bring in settlers, organize defense, and, most importantly, create a stable base of power. Nicholas, who by now had become less a merchant and more a man of records and logistics, traveled with the movement north and west. He was the kind of person every new frontier needed, someone who could count supplies, track men, list donations, and keep an operation alive when excitement faded and winter arrived. And Burzenland was winter. The landscape was wide and harsh, framed by the Carpathian Mountains. Forests felt thicker, the wind felt sharper, villages were scattered and vulnerable. The kind of place where a small watchtower could decide whether a settlement lived or disappeared. The Order did what it always did best. It organized. They raised fortifications, first in timber and earth, then increasingly in stone where possible. They brought in German settlers, people accustomed to structured town life and agricultural routines. Fields were cleared, churches were built, roads were marked. A frontier began to take on the shape of a managed territory. In local stories, people later spoke about the arrival of the white-cloaked brothers as if it were a change in the weather, something inevitable, something larger than any single group. In some villages, they were welcomed as protection. In others, they were watched as strangers. But either way, the Teutonic presence didn't feel temporary. It felt like roots. And that was exactly the problem. Because Hermann von Salza and his brothers had learned something from Acre. If you depend entirely on a local ruler's goodwill, you can be removed as quickly as you are invited. A frontier is strategic, and strategic places make kings nervous. So, the Order did what it had always done when it wanted security. It turned to Rome. They sought papal protection for their new holdings. In the logic of the medieval church, being directly under papal authority could strengthen an institution's independence. It meant the order's territory would not just be a Hungarian border project, it would become part of a larger religious mission protected by the highest spiritual power in Christendom. From the order's perspective, it was a reasonable move, almost necessary. They had already been burned once in relying on changing politics in the Holy Land. Hermann wanted legal armor as well as metal armor. But from King Andrew's perspective, it was unacceptable. Imagine the situation in modern terms. A king invites a highly disciplined, well-funded organization to defend his border. That organization begins building castles. It brings in settlers. It organizes the land. And then it tries to place that territory under an authority higher than the king, an authority that the king cannot command. To Andrew, it looked like a state growing inside his state, a fortress that answered to someone else. The tension escalated quietly at first, in the way serious political conflicts usually do. Meetings, letters, officials exchanging increasingly sharp interpretations of rights and privileges. The order asked for guarantees. The crown insisted on control. Nicholas could feel the change in the air long before it became open conflict. It showed up in the way envoys spoke more stiffly, and how Hungarian officers looked at Teutonic patrols with less friendliness and more calculation. In the sudden importance of documents, who signed what, and which seal carried more authority. Then, in the year 1225, it broke. King Andrew expelled the Teutonic Knights from Burzenland. No heroic last stand, no romantic farewell, just a brutal reality that the land they had built up, forts, towns, churches, fields, was not truly theirs, not in a way that mattered when power shifted. Nicholas wrote in his records, not with dramatic poetry, but with the plain honesty of a man who had watched systems rise and fall. We came to guard another man's border. We leave as men suspect. That sentence carries a modern truth. In politics, trust is temporary. Interests are permanent. The Burzenland episode was a failure in one sense, but it was also a lesson so valuable that it would shape everything the order did next. Hermann von Salza learned that territory offered by a ruler can be taken back by a ruler, unless your claim is protected by higher authority and written into the architecture of power itself. To us, that sounds like the beginning of something dangerous. And it was. Because once an organization believes it has the right to sovereign authority, it stops acting like a guest. It starts acting like an owner. But Hermann's mindset was survival. He wasn't trying to create conflict, he was trying to prevent the order from being erased the next time a ruler changed his mind. He had seen too many institutions die because they depended on one person's favor. So, when the order left Burzenland, they didn't leave weakened, they left wiser. They understood something that would define their next moves. If you are invited to defend a frontier, you must decide whether you are a temporary shield or a permanent power. The Teutonic Order, after Burzenland, knew which path it wanted. And somewhere in the background, a new invitation was already forming. An invitation that would come from the north, from a Polish duke under pressure, from forests and rivers where the last pagan strongholds still held. This time, Hermann would not accept the promise without a foundation stronger than any king's mood. This time, he would demand that the future be written into law before it was built in stone. And Nicholas, with ledger in hand, eyes tired from years of war and travel, would follow once more, knowing that now every new outpost was not just a fortress, it was a claim, a border, a contract with history. Burzenland ended without a grand battle, but the lesson it left behind was sharper than any sword. Hermann von Salza didn't describe it as a defeat. He treated it like a warning, written in ink and sealed in wax. If the order stood on someone else's land, it would always be subject to someone else's fear, and sooner or later, fear would turn into expulsion. So the question in Hermann's mind changed. It was no longer, where can we help? It became, where can we endure? In the medieval world, endurance wasn't only a matter of courage, it was a matter of legal standing, privileges, charters, a clear chain of authority. Hermann understood that the strongest walls were sometimes made of words, especially words recognized by the highest powers in Christendom. And then the next invitation arrived, not from the sunlit coasts of the Holy Land, and not from the mountain borderlands of Hungary, but from the forests and river plains of Poland, Masovia, a region that felt like the edge of the known world for many Western Europeans, a place where farmland met deep woodland, and where the border did not feel like a line on a map, but like a wound that never stopped bleeding. Duke Conrad of Masovia was under pressure. His lands were exposed to raids from the north, from the pagan Prussian tribes who lived among forests and marshes beyond the Vistula. There were skirmishes, ambushes, and the constant fear that a village might wake up to smoke. Conrad wanted a solution that Poland itself struggled to provide, a disciplined force that could hold the frontier, build fortifications, and push danger back. He looked at the Teutonic Order and saw what many rulers saw in them: organization, predictability, a machine that could be moved into a troubled region and set to work. So he sent his offer: land on the Vistula, Comerland, the Helmno region, as a base of operations, support and permission to fight the frontier war. In return, stability. To Conrad, it likely felt like hiring a shield. To Hermann, it looked like a second chance at something much larger than a contract of service. Nicholas traveled with the envoys and the letters. By now, he was more than a merchant, and more than a nurse. He had become what the order increasingly relied on: a man of records, of planning, of careful language. He watched the negotiations not like a poet, but like someone who understood how agreements break. He remembered Burzenland. He remembered how quickly a king's favor could shift into suspicion. So when Conrad's offer was placed on the table, Hermann did not accept it with gratitude alone. He asked, quietly but firmly, for guarantees. Because the order would not be invited, build castles, settle people, and then be told to leave again when the local ruler began to fear what he had created. This is where the story turns from frontier drama into something colder, something that feels uncomfortably modern. Hermann did not put his faith in handshakes. He put it in documents. He went to the highest authorities he could reach, to the emperor, to the pope. He wanted legal armor stronger than any local duke could tear away. In the year 1226, think of it as the mid-1200s, when Europe still moved at the pace of horses and letters, the Emperor, Frederick II, issued the famous document that mattered more than any single battle: the Golden Bull of Rimini. It's often described as a charter granting the Teutonic Order rights over whatever lands they might conquer in Prussia. In plain terms, it was like being handed a future in advance, a promise that if you win territory, you won't hold it as a temporary servant of a local duke, but as an independent power recognized by imperial authority. In a medieval world, that kind of recognition changed everything. Without it, the order would always be dependent on the goodwill of whoever invited them. With it, the order could act as if it had a destiny, because legally, it did. From a modern perspective, this is the moment where you can almost hear the gears lock into place. A ruler needs help, so he invites a disciplined organization. The organization demands legal independence so it won't be removed later. Independence requires charters, seals, and recognition. Recognition brings recruits, money, and justification. And once those elements exist, the organization no longer thinks in seasons, it thinks in centuries. At night, fog rolled off the river and pressed against the wooden walls. Torches reflected in black water. Somewhere beyond the trees, unseen eyes watched the new fort with suspicion, or anger, or simply curiosity. Inside the camp, the order moved in quiet routines: sentries pacing, builders measuring, scribes sealing documents, priests praying. Everything was controlled, everything was organized, and that was exactly what made it powerful, because the order had learned the essential rule of survival. In a chaotic world, the side that can organize wins, not always quickly, but relentlessly. The next step would be to turn this foothold into a network, fort to fort, settlement to settlement, river route to river route. But the beginning, this moment, was the true point of no return. A treaty from a Soviet, a golden seal from an emperor, a mission blessed by the church, and a wooden fort on the Vistula that looked small against the forest, but held inside it the blueprint of a state. When the Teutonic Order finally stepped into Prussia in the early 1300s, the first thing that struck them wasn't an enemy army. It was the land itself. Not open fields where cavalry could breathe, not stone cities where walls could be measured and broken, but forests that swallowed sound, marshes that swallowed boots, and rivers that dictated where you could move, where you could eat, and whether you could survive the winter. If the Holy Land had been a world of sun and stone, Prussia was a world of water and wood. And Hermann von Salza understood immediately that this wouldn't be won by bold gestures. It would be won by infrastructure, by supply, by repetition, by building something that could endure in terrain designed to resist outsiders. That's why the Teutonic Order's first weapon wasn't a charge. It was a fort.
A wooden palisade on the lower Vistula, rough timbers, heavy gates, watchtowers looking out over fog. A small scar in the landscape, but a deliberate one. A place where boats could dock, where carts could unload, where men could sleep behind walls, even if those walls were still only wood. Inside that fort, life moved like a machine. Not a loud machine, nothing dramatic. A quiet one. Serving brothers hauled barrels off wagons. They moved sacks and timbers with the slow strength of people who knew the difference between speed and efficiency. Smoke rose from cook fires and clung to damp air. Horses stamped and snorted, their breath visible in the cold mornings. And somewhere under canvas, Nicholas sat at a makeshift desk, doing what he had become essential for, turning chaos into records. He counted supplies, he tracked shipments, he wrote names beside numbers, he pressed seals into wax, he marked the difference between what the order had and what it needed. It's easy to underestimate that kind of work until you imagine what happens without it. A fort can't eat courage, it eats grain, it eats iron, it eats wood, it eats time. And if you can't measure those things, you can't hold a frontier. That's what made the Teutonic Order different from so many other forces that entered the Baltic. They weren't only warriors, they were organizers, a disciplined institution shaped by monastic rule and merchant logic. They could build and account at the same time. And once the fort stood, Hermann made the next move that would define the Order's strategy for decades. He used the river. The Vistula wasn't just scenery, it was the best road in a land where roads barely existed. Boats could carry more than carts, travel farther than wagons in mud, and keep moving when forests closed in. So barges began to appear, flatboats loaded with timber and sacks, pushed upstream by poles and muscle. Rope lines creaked at rough piers, cargo shifted and settled with every ripple in the current. Supply became rhythm. Then came the next step, expansion. Not as a single dramatic sweep, but as a chain. Fort to fort, each one close enough to support the next, each one positioned to control river crossings, trade routes, and the safest paths through the wilderness. In the early 1330s, the order began establishing key points like Thorn, Torun, on the Vistula. At first, it wasn't the brick town we imagine today, it was timber and mud, scaffold and smoke, but it was placed with intention, a node in a growing network. And around these forts, settlers began arriving. German settlers, often encouraged by promises of land, protection, and legal privileges. They came with ox carts and tools, with seed and plow blades, with the habits of Western town life. The order did not only conquer, it colonized. For every fortress raised, there was a village planned. For every village, a market square measured. And for every market, a set of laws to make trade predictable. Here, the modern world starts to feel close, because this was a system, not just a campaign. The Teutonic administration granted town rights, often based on what later became known as Kolm law, creating urban structures that attracted merchants and craftsmen. This meant the frontier wasn't only militarized, it was economic. In plain terms, the order was building a state out of logistics. To the settlers, this could look like opportunity, safety behind walls, clear rules, access to trade. To the people already living there, the Prussian tribes whose lives were tied to forests, rivers, and sacred groves, it could look like something entirely different, a rearrangement of the world. Trees were cut, fields were cleared, new paths were carved, churches rose where older shrines had stood. Even if no one spoke the language of state building, people felt the reality of it in their bones. And that is where the conflict of this chapter lives, because the order believed it was bringing order and faith into a land it viewed as outside Christendom. But the land already had its own order, just not an order written in charters and wax seals. Nicholas sensed that tension in ways that warriors often don't. He heard it in the rumors carried by traders. He saw it in the way scouts returned from the forest with their shoulders tight, their eyes scanning shadows longer than necessary. At night, fog pressed against the palisade like a living thing. Torches threw thin light into the trees, but the darkness beyond remained untouched. Sometimes a patrol would return and speak of movement. Nothing clear, nothing provable, just the feeling of being watched. In later folklore, people would talk about forest spirits or faceless guardians. But even without myth, the fear was real. The forest gave cover. The marsh gave escape. The terrain itself felt like an ally to those who knew it. The Teutonic response wasn't to abandon the project. It was to harden it. They improved fortifications, they reinforced gates, they tightened routines, they built piers and bridges to stabilize supply. And in some places, they began experimenting with brickmaking, digging clay, forming molds, feeding kilns, because wood could burn, but brick could stand. brick was not just a building material, it was a declaration. We are here for the long term. In the day, you could see the new society forming, a church frame rising as a roof beam was lifted into place, a bakehouse steaming in cold air, a market stall weighing goods, a charter being read under a timber awning, children running between wagons, a plow cutting a fresh line through soil where forest had stood not long ago. And along with all of that, the order's routines continued. Prayers in the chapel, training in the yard, patrols into the woods, scribes sealing documents. The rhythm was steady. It was also relentless. From a modern viewpoint, it's tempting to describe this as inevitable progress. Forts, towns, roads, agriculture. But progress is always someone's story. For another person, it is loss. What the order called stability could be experienced as displacement. What settlers called opportunity could be experienced as invasion. Nicholas felt that contradiction growing inside him. He was a man who wanted things to function, who believed organization could save lives. But now he was watching organization reshape a whole region, whether the people there wanted it reshaped or not. He wrote at night by candlelight while rain tapped the canvas and smoke curled above the flame. His records weren't only numbers anymore. They carried doubts that he never would have spoken out loud. He understood in a way that feels modern that two different ideas of order were colliding, and that in such collisions, someone always pays. Still, the order continued, because once a system is built, it begins to demand completion. It pulls resources towards itself. It justifies its own growth. It creates dependencies. Settlers dependent on protection, forts dependent on supply, supply dependent on controlled routes. Every new piece made the structure harder to remove. By the end of the early 1330s, the Teutonic presence along the Vistula was no longer a single fort. It was a line, a chain of control. River traffic carrying timber and grain, settlements growing behind palisades, markets connecting the Baltic frontier to Western trade networks. And yet, under all that growth, the forest remained. Not conquered, not silent, waiting. At dusk, the trees swallowed light. Fog returned. Somewhere beyond sight, older alliances formed, older loyalties hardened, and anger gathered strength. The Teutonic Order was building something durable. But durability is not the same as peace. And as their forts rose higher and their records grew thicker, the land around them prepared a response, not in the form of one great battle, but in the form Prussia did best. Resistance that moved like shadow through woods and marsh, striking where walls could not reach. That was the reality of Part 6. Not a single dramatic moment, but a slow transformation. A frontier becoming a network, a hospital-born order becoming a territorial power, and the quiet understanding written between ledger lines that the hardest fight ahead would not be fought in open fields. It would be fought in the spaces between forts, where the forest still ruled. In the north, the wind speaks a different language. It doesn't carry salt and heat like Acre. It carries wet grass, cold rain, and the smell of pine. And in the year 1236, that wind swept across a battlefield near a place called Saul, flat Baltic land where the ground can turn to mud in a single afternoon. The men who fought there belonged to a local crusading brotherhood known as the Livonian Brothers of the Sword. They were not strangers to hardship, but that day the frontier reminded them of a hard truth. Discipline alone cannot command terrain. Horses sank, lines broke, signals vanished into rain and fog, and by the time dusk arrived, the Sword Brethren were no longer in order with momentum. They were survivors, carrying the weight of a defeat that threatened to unravel everything the Latin West had tried to build in Livonia. News travels fast when it carries fear. The message crossed forests and rivers to reach the Teutonic Order in Prussia, where Hermann von Salza listened the way he always listened, quietly, without theatrics, as if every word were a coin he meant to weigh before spending. To many men, Saul looked like disaster. To Hermann, it also looked like a crossroads. In the medieval world, a weakened institution rarely stays independent for long. It either collapses or it is absorbed by something stronger. Hermann understood that if the Livonian branch fell apart, Livonia could become a vacuum, one that rival powers, local uprisings, or competing interests would rush to fill. And in a frontier zone, vacuums are dangerous. They pull conflict toward them. So the Teutonic Order stepped in. In 1237, the remnants of the Livonian Brothers of the Sword were folded into the Teutonic structure. In practice, that meant the birth of a northern branch we now call the Livonian Order, linked to the Teutonic Order, sharing its wider mission and legitimacy, but shaped by local conditions. For Nicholas, our steady witness, our man of ledgers and letters, this was a different kind of expansion than building a fort on the Vistula. Here, the order wasn't just raising new walls, it was inheriting someone else's walls, someone else's wounds, and someone else's unfinished promises. He arrived in Riga and felt the atmosphere immediately. The river wind was sharp, the streets were tense. Banners that once stood high now hung lower, heavy with damp and quiet embarrassment. In a chapter hall lit by candles, leaders spoke in controlled voices. No panic, no grand speeches, just the same cold calculation that always follows a frontier reversal. How do we prevent everything from collapsing? The Teutonic solution was what it always was: structure, registers, chains of command, new seals, new lines in the ledger, a uniform identity strong enough to hold together men who had just watched their old identity break. If you want the moment to feel cinematic, it's not a triumphal parade. It's a simple act in a cold courtyard, a white mantle being fastened at the shoulder, and the new cross being accepted as the emblem of a new allegiance. Cloth, cord, and the knot pulled tight, a small motion that carries enormous consequence. But every expansion creates a new edge, and the northern edge of Livonia pressed up against something far more complicated than pagan tribes. It pressed up against the world of Rus. Novgorod and Spuk were powerful centers in the northeast, Orthodox Christian, fiercely independent, and deeply tied to their own trade networks. This wasn't simply a story of Christianity meeting paganism. This was one Christian world meeting another Christian world, and discovering that shared belief did not guarantee shared authority. In modern terms, it's a familiar type of conflict. Competing jurisdictions, competing cultural identities, competing economic interests, each side convinced it was protecting the rightful order of things. Nicholas saw the difference in details. In Novgorod markets, fur and wax and grain moved through hands that did not bow to Western lords. In Orthodox churches, icons glowed in candlelight and incense, and the rituals felt ancient in a different way. To the Teutonic mind, this was still a frontier, but it wasn't a frontier that could be reduced to one formula. And yet, ambition has a way of believing it can. The Livonian branch, strengthened by Teutonic absorption, began to press eastward, not recklessly, not without planning, but with the confidence that comes from recent expansion. The maps in Riga grew more detailed. Lines were drawn along rivers. Wooden markers were placed near lake outlines. Messages were sent. Scouts moved through snow and forest, watching distant settlements from the safety of tree lines. Then geography stepped forward and demanded a vote. Because the land between Livonia and Rus is dominated by water, rivers, wetlands, and lakes. And in winter, those lakes become roads made of ice. The most famous of them was Lake Peipus. In the early 1240s, tension reached a point that it could no longer be managed by diplomacy alone. In April of 1242, forces met on the frozen surface of that lake. Later generations would call it the Battle on the Ice. That title makes it sound clean, as if the world were a stage made of white glass. But standing on a frozen lake in war is not clean. It's wind in your eyes, it's breath freezing in your beard. It's the constant awareness that the ground beneath you is not truly ground. For the Teutonic Knights, heavy armor was both strength and burden. Their tradition favored disciplined shock tactics, forward pressure, controlled acceleration, breaking the opposing line through weight and coordination. But ice is not a forgiving surface. Horses must find traction. Riders must control momentum or risk collapse. Foot soldiers must manage balance while pushing, turning, and holding formation. Nothing about it allows careless movement. On the other side, the Rus forces, led by Prince Alexander of Novgorod, later remembered as Alexander Nevsky, fought with their own advantages: lighter mobility, familiarity with terrain, and a style of engagement that could bend rather than break. The clash didn't need supernatural drama to become legendary. The ice itself provided the tension. A crack doesn't have to swallow an army to change a battle. It only has to create hesitation. It only has to disrupt rhythm. And in a fight where formation is everything, disruption becomes defeat. Nicholas was not in the center of the ice. He was a man of logistics, not a frontline commander. But he was close enough to hear the reports afterward, close enough to see the way faces looked when men returned from an encounter that didn't fit their expectations. The Teutonic advance into Rus did not continue the way it had been imagined. Modern historians debate details, how large the forces were, how decisive the defeat really was. But for the Order's future, what mattered was simple. Lake Peipus was a boundary. Not a permanent border, perhaps, but a warning line drawn by geography and resistance. In the aftermath, the Order did what disciplined institutions do when ambition meets limits. It consolidated. It turned attention back to what could be held, Prussia and Livonia, back to forts, settlements, river routes, and the slow work of turning a frontier into a managed territory. Because the cost of overreach is not always immediate loss. Sometimes it is distraction, and distraction is deadly on a frontier. The year 1242 carried another sting for the Teutonic Order. While its northern ambitions were checked at the lake, Prussia itself began to flare with resistance. The Prussian tribes watched the Order's attention pull toward Livonia and Rus, and they recognized opportunity. And so, while one frontier taught the Order its limits, another frontier reminded it of its vulnerability. Nicholas stood on the palisade of a Prussian fort as fog gathered along the tree line. He could feel the difference between the place he came from, merchant towns with paved streets and predictable rules, and this land where rules had to be enforced every day or they dissolved back into forest. He wrote in his records with a hand that no longer shook from uncertainty, but from fatigue. The Order was now balancing too many edges at once. Prussia needed constant attention. Livonia needed stabilization. The East offered temptation and danger. And the Order's strength, its ability to organize, was being tested not by a single enemy, but by distance itself. From a modern point of view, this is the moment when the Teutonic story becomes unmistakably a story of systems. A system expands. Expansion creates new borders. Borders create new conflicts. Conflicts demand resources. Resources stretch thin. And then the system must decide: retreat, consolidate, or gamble. At Lake Peipus, the gamble failed. But failure in this case did not destroy the Order. It shaped it. It taught a lesson that would echo across the next century. Not every land can be mastered by the same method. As the Baltic wind continued to blow across rivers and pine forests, the Teutonic Order adjusted its gaze. The grand dream of pressing deep into Rus faded into something colder and more practical. Hold what we have. Build stronger. Move carefully. Because in this part of the world, even the ground beneath you can betray you, and the forest, patient and ancient, always waits for the moment when your attention slips.
April in the far north is a month that refuses to make promises. On the calendar, it is spring, but on the land, it still behaves like winter. The sky stays pale and hard, the wind remains sharp, and the ice, especially on a lake as wide as Peipus, holds on as long as it can. That was the setting in 1242, when the Teutonic and Livonian forces met the armies of Rus on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus. From a distance, it must have looked unreal. Banners against the white horizon, men and horses moving across a flat world of ice and drifting snow, the tree line dark and silent like an audience. But up close, it was painfully real. Ice is not a battlefield built for certainty. It creaks, it shifts, it turns every step into a calculation, every movement into a test of traction and balance. The Teutonic knights were used to weight. They wore it like identity. Mail, plate elements, thick clothing beneath, layers that made them powerful in direct pressure. Their tradition favored disciplined forward force, a controlled advance, a tightening formation, an impact meant to break the opposing line. But ice doesn't negotiate with tradition. Horses have to find grip. Hooves slip and recover, or they don't. Armor changes the center of gravity. A rider must constantly adjust, because one wrong shift can turn momentum into collapse. Even infantry has to manage every pivot and push, because a slick surface punishes sudden movement. The Rus forces, led by Alexander of Novgorod, later remembered as Alexander Nevsky, understood this environment in a way the Western knights did not. They were not helpless in open terrain, but here the ice itself was part of the fight. Their soldiers could maneuver with lighter steps. Their formations could bend and redirect. They could let the heavy force come forward, then respond where the ground favored them. When the lines finally closed, the sound was not heroic music. It was the dull impact of bodies and shields, the scrape of iron on ice, the breath of horses turning to mist, and the constant whisper of snow skimming across the surface in the wind. There are legends about that battle, stories of cracking ice swallowing armored men, stories of catastrophe in a single moment. Modern historians debate those details. They argue about numbers, about scale, about how decisive it truly was in the larger context of the Baltic Wars. But even if the ice didn't collapse dramatically, it didn't need to. A battle can turn on smaller things: a patch of slick surface, a disrupted rhythm, a formation that loses its shape, a horse that slips at the wrong time. When the Teutonic advance lost momentum, even briefly, the advantage of weight began to reverse. What had been strength became friction. What had been discipline became difficulty. The Rus infantry pressed, not wildly, not chaotically, but steadily. The Teutonic line began to loosen. Commanders tried to regroup. Standard-bearers planted banners and steadied poles against the wind. Rear elements formed protective lines toward the shore. And then the Teutonic forces withdrew. Measured, not a stampede, but a retreat that admitted the truth. The lake would not be their road into Rus. The battle on the ice did not destroy the order. It did something more subtle and more important. It taught the order a limit. In the medieval imagination, crusading orders sometimes appear as unstoppable machines. But machines rely on the right surface to run. Pipus reminded the Teutonic Order that terrain can refuse your strategy, that weather can veto your ambition, that even a disciplined institution can be forced to step back. In the aftermath, the Livonian branch and the wider order adjusted. The East was no longer an open door. It was a wall of ice and resistance. And that might have been the end of the story for that year, if history were merciful enough to give one lesson at a time. But 1242 carried another blow. While the order's northern ambitions were checked near Pipus, Prussia itself began to ignite. The Prussian tribes watched carefully. They saw the Teutonic focus divided between multiple frontiers, Prussia, Livonia, and now the dangerous pole of Rus. They saw forts stretching like thin nails into forests and marsh. They saw settlers arriving and fields clearing, and they recognized opportunity. You don't need a single organized army to challenge a frontier project. Sometimes you only need timing. Sometimes you only need the courage to strike where the walls are far and the supply lines are vulnerable. The Prussian resistance moved in the spaces between castles, the spaces the Teutonic system depended on but could never fully control. The first signs weren't cinematic, they were practical. A convoy doesn't arrive on schedule. A patrol returns with fewer men than it left with. A settlement sends a runner in the night. Smoke rises from a place that should not be burning. In the Teutonic forts along the Vistula, the mood shifted. Sentries watched the tree line longer. Gates were barred earlier. Tools were kept closer to hand. The order's daily routine continued. Prayer at dawn, work by day. But the space between those activities filled with a new tension. Nicholas, still alive in these years as a recorder and organizer, felt the change as sharply as anyone. He had watched the order expand methodically. He had watched them turn rivers into roads and forests into planned settlements. He had admired the discipline, the efficiency, the way a system could bring stability to chaos. But now he was watching the system meet the truth that every system eventually meets. People resist being reorganized. From a modern point of view, it's the kind of reality we see again and again. An institution arrives claiming to bring order. It builds infrastructure. It introduces laws and taxes. It rewrites land use. It rewrites the rhythm of daily life. Some people benefit. Some people adapt. And some people decide that survival requires resistance, even if the cost is immense. Nicholas wrote by candlelight in a small administrative tent, while rain tapped the canvas and smoke curled above the flame. He recorded reports from Livonia, from the lake, from the river forts. He sealed documents. He counted supplies. But his words became heavier. He could no longer pretend that order meant the same thing to everyone. The order's stability was built on rules and walls and charters. The Prussian stability was built on land, kinship, and sacred places tied to forests and rivers. When those two ideas of stability collided, peace could not be assumed. It had to be enforced. And enforcement is never free. In council tents, commanders began to shift markers on maps. The eastern lines became less ambitious. The focus turned inward. Hold Prussia. Fortify what exists. Protect settlers and supplies. Build stronger positions. Prepare for unrest that now felt less like a rumor and more like an inevitability. Even the small details changed. A horn might be lifted in a sentry's hand, then held back because not every shadow was an attack. A torch might be raised higher to cut fog, because fog was no longer just weather, it was cover. At night, the forest seemed to breathe. Fog rolled between trunks, ravens stirred. The sound of the river continued, indifferent to human plans. And the Teutonic forts, still often wooden at this stage, still vulnerable compared to the brick fortresses of later years, stood like islands surrounded by a sea of darkness. The order had survived the ice. They had survived the lesson of Pipus. But now the more dangerous challenge was taking shape, not as one decisive battle, but as a long wave of resistance across Prussia. Resistance that would test their logistics, their fortifications, their discipline, and the moral story they told themselves about why they were here. By dawn, routines resumed. Builders lifted beams into place, boats moved on the river, scribes opened ledgers, priests gathered men for prayer. The system kept turning. But the air had changed, because the Order now understood that a frontier war is not only fought at the edge of a lake, it is fought in the quiet spaces between your outposts, where you cannot always see what is coming. And as the fog lifted over the Vistula, one thing became clear. The next struggle would not be about pushing forward. It would be about holding on.
When I stand in Malbork today and look up at the red brick walls, it's hard to remember that the Teutonic state did not begin with brick at all. It began with wood. Wood that burned. And that fact explains the next chapter better than any speech. Because the years after Lake Peipus did not reward grand ambition. They rewarded endurance. They rewarded a system that could survive attack, rebuild quickly, and keep its supply lines breathing even when the forest closed in. After 1242, Prussia did exactly what frontier lands often do when an invader's attention is split. It rose. The first wave of resistance wasn't one great battle on open ground. It was the kind of war that drains you quietly. A convoy disappears. A settlement wakes up to smoke. A palisade outpost is suddenly silent. The Order's castles, still mostly timber at this time, became islands in a hostile sea of forest and marsh. Inside those walls, everything tightened. The gates were barred earlier. Patrols became more frequent. Sentries watched longer. The sound of a twig snapping outside the palisade could make a man shift his grip without even thinking. And in the middle of it, the Order tried something it believed could tame the chaos: negotiation. In 1249, after years of resistance, a settlement attempt at peace emerged in the form of the Treaty of Kreisberg. On paper, it offered rights and protections to Prussians who accepted baptism, legal standing, certain property rights, a place within the new order. It was, in modern terms, a strategy of integration, turn enemies into subjects through law. But paper doesn't erase memory, and conversion doesn't always mean belief. Sometimes it means survival. Many Prussians took baptism because it offered protection, but their loyalty remained fragile. The peace held as long as fear held it. Beneath the surface, resentment lived on. And then, in 1260, the fuse lit again. News arrived like a punch to the chest. A defeat at Derbe, farther north against Samogitian forces, shook the Teutonic confidence and sent a message through the Baltic. The Order was not invincible. In frontier societies, that single idea can change everything. If the giant can bleed, people will test it. Prussia exploded. This second uprising, larger, longer, more relentless, became the true crucible of the Teutonic state. It was not a war the Order could end quickly. It was a war fought season after season, in marsh and forest, where heavy cavalry was often useless and where attackers could strike and vanish like smoke. Settlements were abandoned, fields went untilled, forts were besieged, some fell, others held on only because garrisons refused to break even when supply lines thinned to nothing. For the Order, the answer wasn't simply fight harder. The answer was to change the shape of their presence. And this is where the story of Prussia becomes a story of material, of architecture as strategy. Wood could be burned. Brick could not be burned the same way. So the Order turned to brick. It sounds like a construction detail, but it was a revolution. Clay was abundant. Kilns could be fed. Bricks could be produced in large numbers. And once you build in brick, you declare something to the world. We are not leaving. At night, the brick kilns glowed. Smoke rose into a red-tinted sky. In later folklore, people would talk about the red light as if it were a sign. Some even tied it to the Virgin Mary, the Order's chosen patron. But the truth was simpler, and perhaps more powerful. Technology was becoming politics. Each brick castle became an anchor point, a place where a garrison could hold through winter, a place where supplies could be stored, a place where settlers could gather when the countryside became dangerous, a place from which the Order could rebuild after loss. It was slow, expensive, and brutally effective. The Great Uprising dragged on through the 1260s and into the 1270s. It became a war of attrition. It tested everything: the Order's manpower, its supply network, its ability to bring reinforcements from Germany, its capacity to keep morale from collapsing under constant strain. And gradually, the uprisings began to fail, not because the Prussians lacked courage, but because a fortified system is hard to uproot once it spreads far enough. If you cannot destroy the nodes, you cannot destroy the network. and brick nodes held by disciplined garrisons are stubborn things. By 1274, the rebellion's strength had broken. Resistance continued in pockets for years afterward, but the organized wave was over. In 1383, large-scale resistance finally ended. The cost on all sides was immense. The landscape was scarred, lives were lost, whole regions were reshaped. But the order emerged with something it had not fully possessed before: permanence. From that point on, the Teutonic presence in Prussia could no longer be described as a temporary crusading mission. It was a state in the making. And with a state came administration, more complex, more systematic in its logic than many people expect from the Middle Ages. Territory was divided into commanderies. Each commandery had a commander responsible for defense, agriculture, and finance. Registers tracked harvests, rents, and obligations. Courts judged disputes. Town charters shaped trade and self-governance, often bringing Prussia into the broader economic rhythm of the Hanseatic world. In towns like Thorn, markets grew. Merchants weighed goods. Barges moved along rivers. Amber, timber, and grain flowed towards the Baltic. Coin flowed back into the order's treasury. The state fed the castles, and the castles protected the state. But the most powerful symbol of that new reality was still rising along the Nogat River: Marienburg, Malbork. Begun in the late 19th century, it was more than a fortress. It was an idea made of brick, a fortress monastery large enough to function as a capital. A place where prayer echoed under vaulted ceilings, while records were copied in offices and weapons were stored in armories. Even before it became the formal headquarters, Marienburg represented the order's transformation, from a hospital in Acre to a territorial power in the Baltic. And then the world delivered another turning point. In 1291, the Crusader stronghold of Acre fell. The Holy Land, the original stage of the military orders, was slipping away. The Teutonic Order no longer had a stable base in the Levant. Its heart was now in the north, whether it admitted it or not. For a time, the Order's leadership moved through places like Venice, navigating Mediterranean politics and finance. But the reality was clear. Prussia was where their future was being built. In 1309, the Order transferred its headquarters to Marienburg. The center of power shifted decisively. The Baltic was no longer a side mission. It was the main story. And that's the moment when you can look back and see the full arc of Part 9. A crisis of uprisings that forced the Order to innovate. A shift from wood to brick that turned survival into permanence. A network of towns and castles that transformed a frontier into a state. And finally, the rise of Marienburg as the symbol of everything the Order had become. The troubling beauty of it is that it all makes sense. Every step is practical. Every decision has a logic. Fortify because wood burns. Organize because chaos kills. Expand because a frontier without depth is fragile. But from a modern view, you can see the cost. You can see how order, once institutionalized, becomes difficult to challenge. You can see how an institution founded on care can evolve into a machine that governs land and people. You can see how a mission can grow into a state, and how a state begins to justify itself simply by existing. Standing in Malbork today, you don't hear the kilns or the uprisings. You hear rain on stone and wind through corridors. But the brick remembers. It remembers the years that the Order learned the most important lesson of frontier power. If you can survive long enough, you don't need to win quickly. You only need to keep building.
By the time the Teutonic Order settled fully into Marienburg, it had stopped feeling like a temporary crusading brotherhood and started feeling like a state. Not a kingdom with a royal family and a line of heirs, but something just as powerful in its own way. A disciplined institution that governed through routine, through property, through paperwork, through stone walls that looked as if they had grown out of the Baltic earth itself. If you walked through Marienburg in the early 1400s, you would have felt it immediately. This place wasn't built to impress visitors, though it certainly did. It was built to shape behavior. Narrow corridors that guided movement, courtyards that gathered people into order, chapels that reminded everyone why they were here, and offices, quiet, relentless offices, where the real engine of the Teutonic state lived. Because behind the banners and armor, the Order's greatest strength was not the sword, it was administration. Every donation was recorded, every shipment was tallied, every commandery, every estate, every warehouse and river pier had to report upward through a chain of responsibility. Grain didn't simply arrive, it was counted. Timber wasn't simply cut, it was assigned. Taxes weren't simply demanded, they were measured, argued, justified, and enforced. From a modern perspective, it feels surprisingly familiar, a medieval institution running like a corporation, except its mission was sacred, its discipline was monastic, and its headquarters was a fortress. That combination, monastery and state, created a unique kind of power. Each brother lived under vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet the institution itself accumulated land, towns, tolls, and influence. Individually, they owned nothing. Collectively, they became one of the strongest forces in the Baltic. And the Baltic rewarded them. By the early 14th century, trade was the bloodstream of the region. Grain, timber, and amber moved through ports and along rivers into the wider world of the Hanseatic League. Towns like Thorn, Elbing, and Danzig grew into hubs of commerce. Ships came and went, bringing coin and supplies. The Teutonic Order understood something crucial. If you control the choke points of trade, you control far more than markets. You control leverage. You control who prospers and who struggles. You control the future. That's why a city like Danzig mattered so much. At the start of the 14th century, the Teutonic Order's involvement there became one of the most contested chapters of its history. The details are complicated, argued over in sources, and colored by centuries of national memory. But in practical terms, the outcome was clear. The order expanded its control into Pomerelia and took hold of Danzig, securing the mouth of the Vistula and the flow of trade through that region. Strategically, it was brilliant. Politically, it was explosive. Because when you seize a port, you don't just gain income, you gain enemies. The Polish crown, local elites, and rival interests could not ignore a power that now stood between them and the Baltic's economic lifeline. Inside Marienburg, the benefits would have been obvious. More duties collected, more shipments protected, more resources to maintain castles and garrisons, more funding to continue the Order's long war in the east. But outside Marienburg, the meaning looked different. The Order was no longer simply a crusading force against pagan lands. It was a state expanding into territories others claimed. That shift didn't happen in one dramatic announcement. It happened the way these shifts always happen, through decisions that made sense on paper. And while the Order grew richer and stronger, it kept telling itself the same story it had told for generations. We are here for the faith. That story still had one powerful anchor: Lithuania. For much of the 13th century, Lithuania remained one of the largest non-Christian realms in Europe. Its rulers were organized and capable. Its forests and rivers were unforgiving. It was not Prussia. Lithuania could not be swallowed quickly through a chain of fortifications and settlers. So the conflict became long, seasonal, and brutal in its endurance. Campaigns launched, often in colder months when marshes froze and movement became possible. Raids and counter-raids carved scars into borderlands. Castles on rivers like the Neman became staging points, and Western European knights, hungry for spiritual merit and martial adventure, traveled north to participate in these Reisen, campaign journeys that offered both piety and prestige. You can almost see it in Marienburg's guest halls, Bayern heraldry hanging beside the Black Cross, visiting nobles dining under vaulted ceilings, speaking in French or German or Latin, all convinced that they were stepping into a holy war. And to be fair, in church terms, it was still framed that way. Indulgences and spiritual rewards could be attached to fighting in the Baltic, just as they were once attached to going to Jerusalem. The Order's legitimacy rested on the idea that this was not ordinary conquest. This was Christianization. But history has a way of changing the meaning of a war without changing its battles. The turning point didn't come from a decisive siege. It came from a marriage. In the mid-1380s, think 1385 and 1386, the years when the Baltic balance shifted, Lithuania and Poland moved toward union. Through the agreement known as the Union of Krevo, the Lithuanian ruler Jogaila agreed to marry the Polish queen Jadwiga, accept baptism into the Catholic faith, and become king of Poland as Władysław Jagiello. This was diplomacy at its most powerful, an entire geopolitical landscape reshaped by vows spoken in a cathedral rather than on a battlefield. For Lithuania and Poland, it was a masterstroke. Together, they became a massive combined power, capable of challenging the Teutonic Order not only with armies, but also with legitimacy. And for the Teutonic Order, it was an earthquake beneath their feet. Because if Lithuania was now Catholic, officially, publicly, endorsed by the same church that endorsed the Order, then what exactly was the Order fighting? The Order argued, of course, that the conversion was incomplete, or political, or unreliable. They claimed the mission still stood, that Lithuania's Christianization needed enforcement, that the border remained dangerous, that their role as defenders of Christendom was unchanged. But here's the modern problem. Legitimacy isn't something you can declare on your own. It's something other powers agree to believe. Once Lithuania became a Catholic realm tied to the Polish crown, the order's narrative began to fray. In the eyes of many across Europe, the conflict started to look less like a crusade and more like a struggle for land, trade, and influence. That mattered because the order's strength depended on more than soldiers. It depended on donors, on recruits from the Holy Roman Empire, on the moral authority that convinced outsiders this institution deserved its unique privileges. When your story weakens, your alliances weaken. And in the Baltic, alliances decide survival. Inside the order, the tension became hard to ignore. The same brothers who chanted in the chapel and lived under strict rule now governed towns full of merchants and craftsmen who wanted privileges, predictable taxes, and self-rule. Prosperity brought complexity. Towns became wealthy enough to push back. Local elites grew strong enough to negotiate. The order's leadership needed to manage not only frontier warfare, but urban politics and international diplomacy. So by the late 14th century, the Teutonic state stood at its peak, rich, fortified, organized, feared, and yet increasingly trapped by the very success that had built it. It had become too big to pretend it was only a hospital order, too political to pretend it was only spiritual, too wealthy to pretend the vow of poverty had the same meaning it did once on a shoreline outside a car. And perhaps the most dangerous part was this: the order did not collapse in that moment. It continued, strongly. It still marched, it still built, it still governed. But it had begun to lose something that cannot be replaced by brick or coin. A clean reason. A story that convinced the world, and perhaps convinced itself, that its power was necessary. When that kind of certainty fades, institutions don't usually vanish overnight. They linger, they adapt, they harden, and they often become more defensive and more rigid, because rigidity feels like control. If you listen closely to this era, you can almost hear the change in tone between the chapel and the council hall. In the chapel, prayers that assume purpose. In the council hall, strategies that reveal anxiety. The Teutonic Order was still strong. Marienburg still stood like a giant made of brick. Barges still moved along rivers. Towns still paid duties. Castles still anchored the frontier. But the world around them had shifted. And in that shift, the Order's greatest threat was no longer the forest or the pagan grove. It was a new kind of enemy, a neighboring power that could fight them with armies and also challenge them with legitimacy. That's the end of part 10. The Order at its height, yet already beginning to hollow from the inside, because the story that built it was starting to fail. And when a powerful institution loses its story, the next chapter is never gentle.
There are days in history that sound like a bell. You hear them once, and the echo never really stops. For the Teutonic Order, that day was the 15th of July, 1410, Grunwald, or Tannenberg, depending on the language of the person telling the story. By sunrise, the plain was already alive with movement, lines forming, banners lifting, horses shifting under armored riders, heat rising from the ground even before midday, dust hanging in the air like a warning. On one side, the Black Cross of the Order, disciplined, familiar, built on a century of frontier warfare. On the other, the combined strength of Poland and Lithuania, now tied together by alliance and crowned legitimacy. This wasn't a border raid. It wasn't a seasonal campaign. It was a confrontation between two political worlds that had grown too large to share the same space. The Teutonic Order came into that day with confidence. Not arrogance exactly, but the confidence of an institution that had won too many contests of endurance. Their system was strong. Castles, supply networks, trained knights, disciplined infantry, and the belief that they were still the guardians of a sacred mission. But the world had changed. Lithuania's conversion had shifted the moral landscape. Poland and Lithuania were no longer fragmented neighbors. Together, they could bring numbers, coordination, and a united strategic goal. As the day wore on, the battlefield became a storm of dust and controlled violence. Heavy cavalry trying to create decisive pressure, infantry formations bracing and pushing, banners appearing and vanishing in the haze. The sound was not just metal and shouting, it was the deeper noise of mass movement, the steady thud of hooves, the scrape of boots, the dull impact of shields, the strain of men trying to hold a line. And then, the Order's heart was struck. Grand Master Ulrich von Jungingen fell in the battle. However you describe the exact moment, the consequence was the same. The Order lost not just a commander, but a rhythm. When leadership collapses in a tightly disciplined structure, it doesn't simply remove a person. It disrupts the timing that holds everything together. The defeat at Grunwald was catastrophic, not because the Teutonic state vanished overnight. It didn't. Marienburg still stood. Garrisons still held. The order still had experienced men and strong fortifications. But something intangible shattered. The myth of inevitability. Before Grunwald, the order could negotiate from a position of fear. Even rivals had to assume the Black Cross would eventually grind them down through discipline and resources. After Grunwald, that assumption was gone. The order could still fight, but it could no longer rely on reputation alone to keep enemies cautious and allies obedient. In the weeks and months that followed, the order fought to hold what it could. Marienburg became the symbol of resilience, a fortress monastery whose walls seemed to announce that defeat on a field did not equal defeat of a state. But war is never only about walls. It is also about money, morale, and the willingness of people, especially towns and merchants, to keep paying the price. In 1411, the first piece of thorn forced the order into concessions and payments that tightened its finances like a noose. The exact sums matter less than the effect. Indemnities meant debt, and debt meant taxes. From a modern perspective, the pattern is brutally familiar. Lose a major conflict, and you lose not just men, but bargaining power. Then you pay to survive. Then you squeeze your own society to fund that survival. And once you squeeze too hard, the people who keep the economy alive begin to ask why they should continue. Inside the Teutonic state, especially in the prosperous towns, resentment grew. Merchants understood risk. They understood investment. They understood when a project was no longer expanding and had become a costly defensive struggle. The order tried to tighten administration. It tried to enforce discipline. It maintained the outward appearance of stability. Prayers in the chapel, training in the yard, ledgers in the scriptorium. But beneath the routine, something was shifting. The Teutonic state had been built on a balance, protection in exchange for obedience and dues. After Grunwald, protection became more expensive and less certain, while dues became heavier. That imbalance created tension not only with outsiders, but within the order's own lands. By 1440, the pressure formed into something organized, the Prussian Confederation, a union of towns and local elites who opposed the order's rule, taxes, and policies. This wasn't a sudden riot. It was structured resistance, the kind that drafts documents, gathers seals, negotiates alliances, and prepares for a long struggle. That, more than anything, should tell you how the world had changed. The order had once expanded by building fortresses and settling people. Now, its most serious threat came from the towns it had helped develop, towns that had grown strong enough to challenge the very authority that protected them. When conflict finally ignited in 1454, it became the 13 Years' War, an exhausting, expensive struggle that dragged the order deeper into financial and political crisis. It was no longer crusade. It was state warfare, fought over borders, rights, and sovereignty. And it was costly in a new way, not just in manpower, but in the way it forced the order to rely on mercenaries and loans. A medieval state can survive defeat, but debt changes everything. Debt shifts power from ideals to necessity. It makes decisions smaller, narrower, more desperate. The war unfolded through sieges, negotiations, shifting alliances, and long years where nothing was resolved quickly. Towns became prizes, river routes became lifelines, trade became both weapon and hostage. The Hanseatic world watched closely, adjusting its loyalties towards whoever could keep commerce moving. By the time the conflict ended in 1466, the Teutonic Order was no longer the same kind of power it had been. The second piece of thorn reshaped the map. Western Prussia, Royal Prussia, passed to the Polish crown. That included major towns and economic engines, places like Danzig, Thorn, and Elbing. The order retained Eastern Prussia, but now as a vassal, owing allegiance to the King of Poland. Think about what that means in human terms. An order that once demanded legal independence from kings now had to bend to one. A state that ruled through confidence now ruled under supervision. A system built to expand now had to focus on survival, and survival is a smaller story than conquest. Marienburg itself remained a symbol, but symbols can't pay debts. The castle still echoed with prayer, but prayer couldn't restore lost ports. The Black Cross still flew, but it flew over a state that had been reduced, divided, and increasingly constrained by larger powers. And yet, the order did not disappear. This is an important point, because modern storytelling loves sudden endings. The Teutonic Order didn't end with Grunwald. It didn't end with Thorn. It adapted, because institutions with strong routines and deep resources rarely vanish in a single blow. Inside the remaining territories, daily life continued. Officials still recorded dues, priests still held mass, serving brothers still managed warehouses, knight brothers still trained, barges still moved along rivers, towns still needed order, even if they negotiated harder for their privileges. But something had changed in the air.
The order no longer felt inevitable. If you could sum up this era in one image, it wouldn't be a battlefield. It would be a candlelit quiet room in Marienburg, where a map lies open and a hand traces a border that used to be farther west. A quiet moment where the institution realizes, without saying it out loud, that the age of unchecked expansion is over. From a modern perspective, Part 11 is not only a story about military defeat, it's a story about the limits of a model. The Teutonic state had been a machine designed for frontier expansion. Fortresses, settlement, legal frameworks, disciplined force. That machine worked brilliantly when its neighbors were divided and when its mission could be framed as a crusade against pagan lands. But once neighboring powers consolidated, once legitimacy shifted, and once the order had to fight major wars against Christian states that could match it politically and militarily, the machine began to strain. The irony is that the order's strength, its discipline, its organization, its insistence on control, also made it slower to adapt psychologically. A flexible state can pivot its identity when conditions change. A rigid institution often doubles down on routine, because routine feels like certainty. So, Marienburg endured, and the brothers continued their prayers, and the scribes continued their accounts, while the world around them moved into a new era of centralized monarchies and shifting alliances. And somewhere in the silence after Compline, after the candles burned low, you can almost hear the question that haunted them. If we are no longer the unstoppable guardians of a frontier, then what are we now? That question doesn't end the story, but it changes the tone. Because from this point onward, the Teutonic Order would be fighting not only for land, but for relevance, and relevance is the hardest battlefield of all. Prussia as a monastic realm. He converted to Lutheranism. He dissolved the order's monastic rule in Prussia, and he turned the remaining Teutonic territory into a secular, hereditary duchy, the Duchy of Prussia. Then came the scene that symbolized the shift more clearly than any document ever could: the Prussian homage. In Krakow, Albert knelt before the King of Poland and swore fealty. It was not just a personal act of submission, it was a public acknowledgement that the Teutonic Order in Prussia would no longer be a sovereign crusading power. It would become a vassal state, ruled by a duke, bound by secular politics. If you imagine the moment in the hall, banners hanging, nobles watching, candles burning, the echo of footsteps on stone, it carries a strange kind of finality. A man in authority lowering himself, not because he lacks pride, but because the world has made pride too expensive. From a modern viewpoint, it's tempting to interpret that as betrayal, but history rarely fits into one word. Albert didn't erase the infrastructure the Teutonic Order had built. In many ways, he preserved it. The castles remained administrative centers. The towns continued their economic rhythms. The legal systems and records still mattered. The machinery of governance didn't disappear. It simply changed its name and its religious frame. And that's one of the most unsettling truths about state building. Institutions can survive radical ideological change because systems are often stronger than symbols. And yet, symbols matter too. Somewhere in a Prussian tassel, a black cross banner would have been taken down, folded carefully and tied with cord. Not thrown away, not burned in anger, just set aside, like something sacred that no longer had a place at the center of power. It's easy to picture that cloth in candlelight. Wool threads, dark stitching, worn edges. A symbol that once meant mission and authority, now becoming an artifact of a world that had ended. But the Teutonic Order itself did not vanish. That's the part many people forget. The order continued in the Holy Roman Empire, in German-speaking lands, where it still held commanderies, estates, chapels, and hospitals. There, it remained Catholic. There, it maintained a quieter identity, not as a state, more a religious institution with a tradition of service. In those commanderies, life continued in the old rhythm. Morning prayers, work and administration through the day, care for the sick and the poor, training that became more about readiness and tradition than conquest. The order's structure survived because it could adapt. The Black Cross remained, but the meaning of the Black Cross changed with context. In Prussia, the cross became a memory tied to castles and old conflicts. In German lands, it became a sign of continuity, service, discipline, and religious life under shifting political conditions. And that brings us to the deeper question of Part 12. What is the end of an institution like this? If we measure it by territorial sovereignty, then yes, 1525 feels like an ending. The Teutonic state in Prussia becomes something else. The crusading era fades. The story of expansion through frontier war reaches its limit. But if we measure it by identity, the ending is more complicated. The Teutonic Order began as a hospital, a shelter raised in desperate conditions outside Acre, built from sailcloth because there was nothing else. It began with care and language and practical mercy. Over time, that mercy was wrapped in rule, discipline, arms, castles, and political ambition. The order became a state. And states, like all states, generate conflict. Then the state fell away. And what remained, what persisted, was the structure of service and organization. Not in the same form, not with the same power, but with a recognizable rhythm. There's a kind of historical symmetry in that. A shelter becomes a fortress becomes a state dissolves. And the institution, stripped of its territorial crown, returns, at least partly, to the quieter work it began with. Standing at the end of this story, the modern mind wants to ask a simple question. Was it worth it? But history doesn't begin with a single intention. It isn't. It's guided by thousands of small decisions, each one reasonable in the moment. A hospital built because wounded men could not speak to the doctors around them. A request for a charter because without legal standing, the hospital would not survive. A fort built because without a fort, settlers and supplies would be lost. A castle built of brick because wood burns. A port controlled because trade pays for defense. A war justified because legitimacy matters. A secularization chosen because survival demands change. No single step guarantees the destination, yet the destination still arrives. And maybe that is the real legacy of the Teutonic Order for us today. A lesson about how systems grow. How a mission can expand beyond its original shape. How organization, one of the greatest human strengths, can create both stability and domination. How symbols outlive the people who first stitched them. And how history rarely ends with a dramatic collapse.